the big question on everybody's mind is, what about work? Which tends to be one of the big questions. At this forum last year, I described some of the research we've been doing looking at activities, because quite often, I think most of you have come to the conclusion that when you're examining these questions about work, it's much better to start from the level of activities that people do and think about what's now possible to automate versus not, as opposed to try to make kind of top-down decisions. And what we typically find is that if you look across different occupations, this picture just shows each of these dots is an occupation. On the vertical axis, you see, if you like, if an occupation is higher up on the vertical scale, it simply means that the constituent activities that make up that occupation are relatively easy to automate using currently demonstrated technologies. If you're lower down, it means there are fewer of those. And then the horizontal axis just simply shows the wage scale. What you see here is that this has got very little to do with wages and a lot to do with the nature of the activities involved in any constituent occupation. What you also see is that something like only about 10% of these occupations have the vast majority, close to 100%, of the constituent activities that are easy to automate. The other important thing to note on this chart is the fact that something like 60% of occupations have about 30% of their activities that can be automated. That's actually an important point that's often lost. What that point basically says is that many, many more occupations will be complemented by machines than automated away. And that point is often lost in these discussions. It's also important to note that the density of these activities, because we're talking about activities, is much higher in some sectors than others. So as you can see in sectors like manufacturing, there's a high density of these easy to automate tasks, whereas in other sectors, not so much. And this varies, of course, country by country, as you might imagine. Similarly, if you look across the world, you see that the easy to automate tasks are distributed in very interesting ways across different kinds of countries. But I think in some ways the key question, because all we're talking about right now is technical possibility to be able to automate these activities. The key question is, at what pace and how much will this actually translate into automation of actual jobs and work? And what we find is that this question really depends on several factors. And quite often it's easy to focus just on the first factor, which is it technically feasible in some lab somewhere to automate something? We think there are a few other factors that are important to consider. The second one here is the cost of the cost of development and deployment of these technologies. This is particularly important because if you think about, by analogy, something like the electric car. The electric car in the form that we can recognize it today was first demonstrated in the late 60s. But it's taken a very, very long time, mostly because of that second factor, before these things have started to show up on the street. In fact, the first driverless car to drive across the United States, which was a DARPA project, actually happened in the late 80s. And still, driverless cars haven't quite fully showed up yet. So the second point is an important point. The third point, in some ways, may be the most important point, which is how all of this intersects with our labor markets in terms of quality, quantity, and even the wages associated with it, with jobs. And that factor in particular is what mostly drives the differences you will see across sectors and across countries. And that's an important factor. Then, of course, you've got the benefits that go beyond simply labor substitution, as well as social and other regulatory factors you take into account. So when you take all these things into account, where do we end up? Well, as you might imagine, because of these 5 factors, it's very hard to make predictions, and we're not about to make any predictions. So the best that anybody can do is often to think about scenarios for these factors and how they might actually play out. And in the work that we've done, we come to the conclusion that we're not about to face a jobless future, at least not anytime soon. And I'll explain that in a second. In fact, we've come to summarize at least our perspective as jobs lost, jobs gained, and jobs changed. And that's actually quite important because quite often when this conversation comes up, there's overwhelming focus on that first part, the jobs lost, and hardly any discussion about the jobs gained and the jobs changed part of it. So where do each of those pieces come from? Jobs lost. If you build scenarios, as I said, across all these things, in our midpoint scenario, it looks as if by 2030, something like 15% of the global workforce at that point in time could be displaced from automation. And that's a midpoint scenario. And that's 15%, which is close to about 480 million people. That's a big number. And that's important to think about. But let's also think about the jobs gained part of it. So where do the jobs gained come from? The jobs gained come from when we have economic growth and productivity, which often is driven by these technologies, that creates jobs in the economy. We also know that there'll be jobs in the economy that come from the fact that prosperity is rising around the world. There's aging, which is going to create a whole demand for a whole new set of jobs. And we know that we're going to be investing in infrastructure and climate adaptation and a whole bunch of things. That's another source of jobs. But there's actually a third part, which I always find quite interesting, and it's the data geek in me, which is quite often a lot of these jobs are jobs we can't even imagine. And in fact, it's actually quite interesting. If you look at, say, the US economy, in every 10-year period, something like 8 to 9% of the occupations in any 10-year period did not exist in the previous 10-year period at all. This is the equivalent, if we had looked in the government statistics in 1995, the occupation called web designer did not exist. But in the 10-year period after that, it did. It was cataloged. So there's a lot of jobs that emerged that we don't know about. So when you put all this into the mix, what do the jobs gained part of this look like? Well, in our estimate, in our midpoint scenario, again, these are scenarios, we estimate that something like about, as much as jobs that can accommodate as much as 21% of the global workforce could be created and gained by 2020, by 2030. So as you can see, we come out ahead, if you like. Now, of course, these are scenarios and they'll vary country by country. And in fact, you can see that with just 3 countries here where we show jobs lost in this midpoint scenario, jobs gained, but also the gray area, which indicates the new people entering the workforce that are going to need to be accommodated by job creation. As you can see, of course, in a country like India, which is a young country, the number of people entering the workforce is a very substantial number. Now, how this plays out country by country, of course, depends on what happens in those countries around economic growth, business dynamism, entrepreneurship, and how the labor markets in that economy actually work. So these are important, these are very, very important considerations. So if in fact, if what I'm trying to tell you is that let's not worry about the jobless future, at least according to our midpoint analysis and scenario here, but can we just sit back and, this will all work out? And I think the answer is overwhelmingly no, actually.